Dear sirs and madams, dear salon friends, when I arrived in Tel Aviv in 2017 and accepted my position as the head of the library of the Goethe-Institut, one of the first actions I had to take was to attend the city administration and to register for the so-called Arnona, that means the city tax. Next to the municipality building is a memorial for the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, in front of which I stood pensively for a while. The monument is made of broken stone. It is supposed to represent the earthquake in Israeli consciousness, which was caused by the murder. At that time, I noticed his famous quote, "Peace is not made with friends, peace is made with enemies." Or more precisely, you don't make peace with friends, you make it with your very unsavory enemies. Now, 3 years later, it is the 25th anniversary of his death, and we are taking this as an opportunity to present the biography about Rabin, which was already published in 2019, written by one of his political companions, Itamar Rabinovich. In this context, I would also like to thank the German Wallstein publishing house for its cooperation. We have won the Israeli-American journalist Mairav Zonszein as a controversial discussion partner. Today, our competition is the counting of the American election results. So I'm very pleased that so many of you are loyal to us or are here for the first time. And I wish you all a very interesting evening. I'm happy to hand over now to our moderator, Maria Sterkel, from the Austrian Der Standard. She will also introduce our panelists in a more detailed version.
Hello, good evening. It's my pleasure to be with you here. Usually we meet in Goethe-Institut and have some drinks and some snacks before and after our panels, but now that's obviously not possible. But I'm even more happy that we make the best out of it and also have a guest here from California, from Santa Cruz, which obviously wouldn't be possible if we were all together in Tel Aviv right now. Our topic of tonight is the legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. We had different memorials already in the past few days. And today we decided to make it a little bit different, not to look only in the past, but to talk also a lot, give a lot of space to current Israeli politics and global politics, and also talk a little bit about the US election. I would like to start introducing Itamar Rabinovich, who closely worked with Rabin in different functions as a consultant and chief negotiator for Syria, as an Israeli ambassador to the United States from 93 to 96. And then later was also president of Tel Aviv University and held different positions. I'm reading that now because it's so much that it's hard to remember. He's president emeritus of the Israel Institute, professor emeritus of Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv University, distinguished global professor at New York University, and a distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institution. I hope I didn't forget anything important. And of course, also he's the author of the book that we will deal with tonight. The English title is Yitzhak Rabin, Soldier, Leader, Statesman. And I recommend to all of you reading it, to the German speakers. There's also this German edition that Marietta has already mentioned. It's an interesting biography, like all the good biographies of politicians. It doesn't only address the politically interested reader, but also kind of sucks you in because you would like to know more about the fascinating person that he was. Itamar, would you be so kind to share with us just a little? You prepared a statement about the legacy of Rabin, and from your point of view and from your expertise, we're all curious to hear it.
Yeah, there are, in a way, two competing legacies. The Rabin Center, which was built to commemorate Rabin and serves as a museum in Tel Aviv, in its first years stressed very much Oslo, the peace process with the Palestinians, as the main legacy of Rabin. And correctly, they changed the focus a little later. In my view, it has always been leadership. Yes, Oslo, of course, is a very important agreement, a very important turning point. Everything that is happening now, interestingly, with Abu Dhabi, with other countries, could not have happened without Oslo, because if the Palestinians accepted Israel, why wouldn't the Emiratis accept Israel in a way? So that is very important. And of course, the fact that most Palestinians in the West Bank do live under Palestinian control, not Israeli control, is equally important. But I think in the long run, historically speaking, it's the leadership. Rabin represented a very unique style of leadership. He was not a charismatic leader. He was an authoritative leader. His authority with the Israeli public rested on his expertise. He was Mr. National Security, and he was in full command of the subject matter that he had to turn into policy. He was very credible. He was considered to be very honest, outspoken, sometimes maybe too outspoken, direct. And very importantly, he came into power for a second term because he had been prime minister first time earlier, and had to resign at that time, with a sense of mission and with a vision. He did not come in just to enjoy power, the trappings of power, such as they are in Israel, but to implement a vision, the vision of change, what he called changing the order of priorities in Israel, not to invest resources, economic and political, in West Bank settlements, but to invest them in building an infrastructure for the 21st century, for integrating the million newcomers from Russia, and a vision that by settling the relationship with our immediate neighbors, Syria, the Palestinians, Lebanon, Jordan, would prepare the ground for confronting the more ominous, the more serious threats that Israel was and is facing from the East, now just Iran, at the time Iran and Iraq. So a leader who is there with a vision, who has the capacity to implement it and has all the qualities that I mentioned, is quite unique in Israel and elsewhere. And I think as we look around the globe, not too many people come to mind as great leaders nowadays. Fortunately, we are guests of the Goethe-Institut, and the president of Germany, the chancellor, is one name that comes to mind today, but not too many other names. So Rabin still evokes a great deal of interest and admiration around the world because of, not so much because of Oslo, but because of this kind of leadership.
Mm. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Mairav Zonszein to give her point of view, which is obviously different because you are younger. Mairav was, correct me if I'm wrong, you were a teenager when at the time that he was assassinated. Mairav is a journalist. She's a founding editor also of the Plus 972 magazine. She's a contributor to Jewish Currents, and she has written for some of the most important media outlets in the United States: the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Intercept, Vice, Foreign Policy, the New York Review of Books, and many others. She reported for The Guardian and from the West Bank, and she was also an editor of Haaretz. She's lived in Israel for half of her life and also in the United States. So she has both angles. And I'm very grateful that she's here with us today. You will give us another perspective on his legacy. Yeah, the stage is yours.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be able to speak with Itamar Rabinovich. I feel like, looking at Rabin's legacy today is very bittersweet and very tragic. The political landscape in Israel today, in some ways, looks nothing like it did when Rabin was assassinated. The thought of a two-state solution is farther than we've ever thought it to be, and the Israeli political body politic is much more right-wing, arguably. The notion of a Palestinian state, a viable one in the West Bank and Gaza, seems like impossible, and the Zionist left and the Labor Party has been decimated in recent elections. There is almost no Zionist left to speak of right now in parliamentary politics. So in that way, it's a very different landscape. In other ways, nothing has changed. We still face the exact same problems. There's still a military occupation. There is still Palestinian disunity and mistrust. There, is still settlements as a main impediment to an actual Palestinian viable state. And the thought that Netanyahu and Abbas would be in the same room together seems crazy. A lot has changed and nothing has changed. And I think, it's extremely emotional right now, considering what's happening on the ground with the Anti-Netanyahu protests, which I'm sure we can get into later. But, in some ways, the legacy of Rabin's assassination is the death of the Israeli left and the death of liberal Zionism as he understood it. And I'm happy to get into that more later. But I think, the trajectory that we've seen is one where the left has become incoherent and defensive. And even if, what was so amazing about Rabin is that he wasn't necessarily a left-wing politician. He was a pragmatic politician, and he understood security through a very specific lens. He became this myth for the left because he represented what so many Israelis wanted. He represented the notion that we aren't going to keep people under occupation forever, and we aren't going to be able to continue in this manner forever. And in that sense, he became a very important leader, and there hasn't been, as Itamar said, anybody like him since. And so the problem for the Israeli left, as the right wing started to dominate the narrative for various reasons that we can get into, the Israeli left held him up. People who wanted to see a two-state solution, who wanted to see peace, which again, I can also break down because those two terms have become very problematic and rendered somewhat meaningless when you look at the reality on the ground. But there's become this gap between what Rabin represented and what actually has been going on. And I think that has been the real demise and the real tragedy since Rabin, that the Israeli left has not figured out how to come up with a coherent vision. And in many ways, the assassination was a declaration of civil war that we see, panning out to this day. A civil war between right and left, between secular and religious, between settlement and non-settlement, between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, and these things have not gotten any better. They've become much, much more difficult to deal with. In many ways, unfortunately, things have gotten much, much worse since that happened, and I think the wounds are still very much open. And in that sense, the impact has been a loss of hope and a loss of leadership. Mm-hmm. So hate to end it on such a sad note, but that's.
But actually, I wanted to start with a very personal question about Itamar, about your point of view, because in all the remembrance events that we had in these days, it was always about this abstract figure that remains abstract, but kind of everybody has a feeling for him, or some kind of associates him as an as a brilliant figure in history, but you don't often have the opportunity to talk to somebody who knew him from such a close angle as you did, spending many years with him. So I would like to ask you, Itamar, could you think of any experience, of any event that you would say would sum up his person very well, his way of relating to people, his way of dealing with conflicts?
Oh, yes. Actually, today they broadcast a short interview with Rabin's sister, Rachel, who lives in a kibbutz on the Lebanese border, and she was very personal and said, I didn't lose the prime minister, I lost my brother, whom I love very much. They actually were very close because the mother died when they were young. The mother was, by the way, in my voyage, Odyssey, in researching and writing this book, my main discoveries had to do with the early life of Rabin. I knew the latter part, the policy and so forth, very well from personal experience, but I had to research more profoundly the earlier years. And what struck me the most was the figure of the mother. Her name was Rosa. She was from Russia. Her nickname in Little Tel Aviv of the 1930s was Red Rosa, after Rosa Luxemburg, because she was a firebrand. She was a firebrand with very explicit political views, but she hated politics and party life. And this is something that he inherited directly from the mother. Rabin was a very awkward politician. He didn't have the stamina for what they call in America pressing the flesh, shaking hands, patting shoulders, kissing babies, conducting small talks with people. He didn't like any of that, and that made him an unsuccessful politician in his first term. He improved a bit, became more of a politician later on, but retained many of these qualities. He was a very shy, introverted person. His wife, Leah, in a way mediated between him and society, the external world. She was in charge of social life and so forth. So this very tough man with this very tough exterior were actually very shy, and once you penetrated the shield and he began to trust you, he was a very kind of pleasant person, but you had to penetrate the shield. Mm-hmm. But he was also a man who demanded loyalty, but he also gave loyalty. I mean, when I negotiated for him with Syria, negotiating with a country like Syria is not a simple task. You go somewhere one-on-one with a Syrian negotiator, and he then has a story or a version of what happened, may or may not be true. You need the prime minister to trust you, that what you report home is correct and precise. And you could be 100% sure that if you went on a limb in the negotiations, you could trust that Rabin was behind you. Mm-hmm. Now, when I spoke before about the trust of the public, Rabin took responsibility. There was a famous incident under his watch when an Israeli soldier called Nachshon Waxman was abducted by Hamas. And the Secret Service found out where he was, and a small commando unit was sent to try to liberate him. It failed, he was killed, and so was one of the officers in the commando unit. Rabin went on television that night. He looked sort of at the public, at the eye from the screen, and he said, I am the prime minister, the decision was mine, and I am responsible for this failure. And it was not the only time that he did that. Now, it was not a play. No political consultant told him that, you should be frank with the public and win their trust. That was him. But this was the kind of quality that bought him the kind of trust. I sat on his first meeting with President Clinton as president. and in many other meetings. And they both, sort of, in a way, fell in love with one another. Clinton admired, he saw Rabin was the older man, in a way, if I be a cheap psychologist, the father figure he never had, a general and admired army leader for somebody who did not serve in the military, somebody who could take bold decisions. And Rabin admired the very capable politician, policymaker that Clinton was. And it's just very much like one another. And Clinton always used to say to me and to others, I just love this man, and I particularly appreciate the fact is that what you see is what you get. If he tells you something, this is it. If he doesn't agree with you, he will give you a no. But he won't tell you a yes and then not implement it. They were kind of quality. And so the many hours that I sat with him and Clinton were among obviously the most interesting hours of my life.
Mm. Now, you know, many people have this expectation that you have to be kind of born a leader. You know, either you have these qualities or you don't have them. But the way you describe Rabin is, you know, as a shy, introverted person who had difficulties talking to people. It seems almost like he grew into being a politician, or he grew into being a leader.
Yeah. So I should say something about the subtitle of the book, the Soldier, Leader, Statesman. I chose this subtitle in order to indicate a progression. There was a progression in Rabin's life. Also, Rabin did not have far-reaching ambitions as a young man. You know, they used to say Moshe Dayan, Yigal Allon, Ehud Barak. When they were lieutenant or captain, everybody said, oh, he's going to be chief of staff, he's going to be prime minister. Nobody said that about Rabin. And Rabin always had the next station in mind. Obviously, he was an ambitious man and he wanted to move on. And when he was general, he wanted to be chief of staff. And, you know, then when he went into politics, he wanted to be a cabinet member. He obviously had ambition, but there was a progression from phase to phase, and you know, some qualities became more pronounced. Some qualities or deficiencies he managed over the years to shed. And you know, Rabin at 70 was not Rabin at 35. He was a very different man. And so he became. He didn't want to be a politician. He wanted, you know. Let's go back to the point of when he joined the elite unit of the military force of the Jewish community in Palestine, the Palmach, in the middle of World War II, when Rommel was not too far from Palestine. His original plan, he was, by the way, an outstanding student in the agricultural school in the Galilee in Kaduri. And his original plan was to travel to California, not too far from where Mairav is now, in Santa Cruz. One of the campuses of the University of California specialized in agriculture. And he wanted to study water engineering and to come back to Palestine, participate in the construction of the country. But, you know, life took him, obviously, during World War II to a military career. But he wanted to participate in shaping the life, to be influential. And if you had to go into politics for that, then awkwardly he did it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, talking about the title, you know, the title of the German translation is completely different from the English of your book.
When peace,
It's Frieden noch möglich schien. In English, it's when peace still seemed possible. Now, this title, it has two implications. That first, peace seemed possible at that time, and second, now peace is impossible or seems impossible. Would you agree that back then it was really, peace was something that people were convinced they would really experience it during their lifetime, or it was something that they were striving for, but nobody could really dare to believe that it would be achieved during their lifetime? And the second implication, do you really think that peace is impossible now?
No. First of all, there was a euphoria in the mid-90s. particularly around 1994. In 1995, some clouds began to gather, but in 1994, with Oslo being implemented, peace with Jordan, normalization with other countries. We had the Middle East Economic Conference, the first one in Casablanca. Countries like Morocco, Mauritania, Qatar began to normalize with Israel and opened diplomatic offices here. And so there was a euphoria. There was a sense that peace was around the corner. Obviously, it was somewhat removed from reality, but the euphoria was there. Now I'm less pessimistic than Mairav. I'm obviously the current situation, particularly with the Palestinians, is bad. The prospect of peace with Syria does not exist now because Syria itself doesn't much exist as a state. We have a new avenue of normalization with countries such as the Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan and maybe others. It's not, I'd like to emphasize it, it doesn't substitute for peace with the core issues, but it is a peaceful avenue. But I believe that the reality is that at some point, the current situation would become untenable, mostly because of demographics, and a decision will have to be made. We may have to go through a crisis in order to reach that point. It may be awkward, and it's not around the corner, but I believe that in the long range, there will have to be separation between us and the Palestinians.
Mm. But still, we could feel some euphoria also now when there were these peace treaties with the Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan. You could feel that many people perceived it as a breakthrough.
Well, the two governments, the Trump administration and the Israeli government, were very much pumping it up. Secondly, it is important. As it happens, I spent the first part of this week in Abu Dhabi, meeting with a think tank and meeting with policymakers in Abu Dhabi. They mean this to have to be a very meaningful relationship, and it is important. The Emirates is an important Arab country or Middle Eastern country, and but as long as we remember that normalization is not peace, it was not an enemy, and it was not peace for peace, because it was a transaction. They gave us normalization and they received the suspension of annexation and the F-35 from the United States.
Can I chime in?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Itamar just said. If we're talking about the Arab normalization deals, then I can just chime in and say that suspension of annexation is a complete political spin. I mean, that's not what happened. Annexation has already de facto taken place in many parts of the West Bank, and using annexation as some kind of leverage in a deal is a way that Netanyahu has used this to his advantage. He also denied that he knew about the sale of the F-35s, as I'm sure you would agree. So it's a little bit different. Using annexation as a card, as a bargaining chip is cynical and is not a reflection of the reality on the ground. And so, Netanyahu likes to talk about this as peace for peace, but as you said, this is actually arms for peace, and normalization, while may be a good step, completely excludes the Palestinians. And that does change, the precedent of the Arab Peace Initiative. It changes the incentive of the world to do anything about the Palestinian issue. But as you said, there's absolutely no way to get away from the fact that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean today, there are almost about the same number of Palestinians and Israelis, and the one sovereign is Israel. In the West Bank to a certain degrees, as well as in Gaza to certain degrees. I mean, that is the reality today. And so, for Trump and Netanyahu to push these as some kind of, these are countries that already had economic and geopolitical interests. They've already been in contact for many years. This is really just a repackaging of a reality on the ground that, it also sends a message to Israel that it can continue to do as it pleases, and have to pay zero price. And that actually is very different than what Rabin was under, because when Rabin became prime minister a second time, it was after Bush had threatened, to pull money from military aid for Israel because of the settlements. I mean, he was in a much different reality than we are in today. So I just don't, I have to say that the suspension of annexation is a joke.
Yeah, but one could argue that now having closer ties with some Arab states could also mean that there is more pressure from these states on Israel to solve the Palestinian issue. One could argue that these leaders might risk to lose their face if they just, ignore the fact of the situation on the ground and the fact of the settlement policy that Israel is following. You don't agree?
Well, it's certainly true that the people in Bahrain and some other countries certainly are not represented by their governments. And so as far as the long term, that might have an issue. It's sort of like when Sharon pulled out of Gaza. Nobody thought that that was a bad idea, but the way in which it was done did not guarantee, anything good for anybody in the future. So it's not just about the content, it's about how it's being done and how it's being framed. And, who is Israel at war with right now? It's at war with the Palestinians. I mean, there's a Palestinian administrative detainee who is sitting on his deathbed with 100 days of hunger strike. He's been held without charge. That needs to be addressed. That needs, it's very nice to celebrate normalization, but you have somebody at your door who's being held without charges. I mean, that is a human rights violation that's happening on a daily basis. So.
Now, you now being in California, assuming that Joe Biden is making the race, he would definitely not be somebody who would celebrate, pump up the whole normalization issue, because that's usually not what happens when a new president is put into office. But what do you expect from Joe Biden administration? Would there be more pressure on Israel regarding the situation of the Palestinians?
And I can give a short answer and then let Itamar chime in. But, I think it was either Netanyahu's advisor, Dori Gold, or somebody else in the Likud who said recently, the Biden-Harris ticket is the most pro-Israel ticket that you can get. Biden, even more so, it means that Biden is going to do absolutely nothing to make Israel change its behavior on the ground. That's been his record. It's again the question of annexation. He and many Democrats have come out against annexation, but annexation is not the issue. The issue is what's happening on the ground, which is de facto control. So annexation is just a fancy way of avoiding the issue. But if you look at Biden's foreign policy advisors, they've talked about, two-state solution, not taking any unilateral steps. I mean, if Biden is not going to return the embassy, as he said, from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv, then he is de facto recognizing that Israel has annexed East Jerusalem. Same thing with the Golan Heights. Again, like if Biden wants to restore some of the Palestinian, the embassy and kind of restore the relationship with the Palestinian Authority, that might reverse a little bit of the damage, but that does not bring us any closer to a solution. If U.S. policy for a very long time, specifically under Democrats, has done nothing to force Israel to concede or to pull out of settlements. And, unlike Bernie Sanders, Biden has made very clear that conditioning aid of any kind, no matter how much it contradicts their own stated policy, he will do nothing to make Israel pay a price. That to me is basically almost the same as what we have right now.
Itamar, do you agree? What would you expect from President Joe Biden, his administration, when it comes to the situation on the ground?
No, not quite. I think, first of all, if it turns out that Biden wins the elections and becomes the president, it is a blow to Netanyahu. I mean, one of the sources of Netanyahu's political strength is his very close relationship with Trump. And that's one of his mainstays. And if Trump is removed, Netanyahu loses, both materially and in terms of his prestige and self-confidence. Second, you know, the election campaign promises are not always, do not always turn into policy. Of course, Biden would say everything that he said. He has 70% of the Jewish vote, and he wanted to keep it. Let's remember that Biden was the vice president of Obama, that Obama represented a very different policy, and he was part of that team. That the Democratic Party itself underwent a change. The left wing of the Democratic Party is much stronger than it was. And therefore, I don't expect a very radical change from right to left for a number of reasons. First of all, Biden will have other priorities. You have to deal with reconstructing public life in America, dealing with huge problems resulting from this ugly campaign, from the pandemic, the relationship with Russia, with China, with Western Europe, with NATO, huge domestic and foreign policy challenges. The Middle East is not going to be on top of the agenda. And every president, before they undertake a policy, need to ask themselves, how likely is it to be successful? Am I going to earn a Nobel or am I going to fail? And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a very tempting prospect at this point. So I expect a Biden policy to return to the more traditional pattern of democratic administrations, moves such as recognizing the non-existent annexation of the Golan. I would say in brackets, the Golan was never annexed by Israel. Israeli law was extended to the Golan. It was not annexed. Begin knew what he was doing. You know, shutting the American consulate to the West Bank, expelling the Palestinian embassy from Washington. Steps like that, I'm sure will be reversed or would be reversed by Biden. And maybe he could bring the Palestinians back into the picture. So we'll see a change, but I don't expect a radical change right away. And let's remember, the best laid plans made by mice and men are then turned around by events. Bush 43 did not expect to be active in the Middle East when he became president, and then came 9/11 and everything changed. Something can always happen in the Middle East that will draw a Biden administration much deeper than it anticipates right now.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't mention the settlements. If I
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Let me do that. I wouldn't use Meirav's term of that we already have a virtual annexation. What we have is what I call a creeping annexation. Sometimes people say that Netanyahu is a status quo prime minister, but there is no status quo. The status quo is drifting in the wrong direction of what I call one statehood. And therefore, my policy recommendation, if I were to make one to an Israeli prime minister or to an American administration looking at something practical to do, would be not to look right away for a final state agreement right now, because it's not available right now, but to look at an interim agreement that will stop settlement expansion, new settlements, and other measures that add up to what I call this drifting, drift towards one statehood or creeping annexation. And obviously there will be a difference in this regard between the Trump administration and the Biden administration.
Mairav, do you agree?
I mean, you know,
Mairav?
yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've already said it. I mean, you can call it creeping annexation or whatever you call it, but if the U.S. government's policy isn't to have Israel's actions I mean, Israel is the largest benefactor of foreign military aid, and the promise to continue that aid happened under Obama. The same Obama that everybody likes to say was, so bad for Israel. He was probably one of the most pro-Israel presidents Israel has ever had. He had the right intention, and he faltered very, very quickly. And he was stifled by a pro-Israel lobby and by a Congress that is nowhere near ready to do that. So, I'm actually hopeful that that's changing. But the bottom line is that, Israel will not do anything to stop this creeping annexation if there aren't serious consequences for its actions. I mean, it just got normalization deals as a reward for what? For continuing to do everything that I mean, the thing that's crazy is that if you look at Netanyahu's policy, he is the most anti-Zionist leader Israel has had. He has done nothing to secure Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. If that's what Israelis want, if that's what America thinks is best, then it really needs to put its money where its mouth is.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking about, we already talked about pressure from outside on Israel, that now both of you agreed that this pressure is not too big. Now let's talk about inside. I mean, now during this COVID crisis and all, after the series of elections that we had in Israel, there's a big mistrust concerning the government. Some of this lack of trust is also reveals itself in demonstrations that we have that gained a lot of force during the past few months. Would you think that this lack of trust in the government and also this frustration with the government could translate itself into a higher pressure on the government also concerning the Palestinian question, or is that too far-fetched?
Can I?
That goes to both of you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let me respond first. Obviously, the Israeli public and public opinion drifted to the right in the past 25 years, partly as a psychological response to external threats, particularly the Iranian threat, but also because the right-wing governments, particularly the Netanyahu government, have invested a great effort in influencing the media. You cannot have today a talk show on radio or television without one or two right-wing representatives. It influences public opinion. So I think what I would like to see is a change of government, and then a change of the line that is given to the Israeli public, a change of public opinion by a different government, and then the ground would be set for a change of policy. You don't begin, I think, with a change of policy before public opinion itself has been altered. And here, of course, the challenges are that the alternative to the government today is not a left-wing government, it's a centrist government. And the left in Israel is weak. And you're not going to win an election by running on a leftist platform in Israel. You can win an election by running on a centrist line. Unfortunately, the center suffered a deadly blow when Mr. Gantz joined the government the way he did, so that in the next election, call it the center-left camp, does not have a major candidate to put forward. Maybe they can put together a bloc, but the kind of alternative that Gantz represented in previous elections doesn't exist right now. So it's very difficult to see an immediate or short-term profound change in Israeli politics. I think we may have to live with the current reality for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. But let me just ask, so I know if I really understood your point. You say the alternative would not be a leftist government, but a center-left government, because this is just the reality we are facing right now in the Knesset and in the political landscape we have in Israel, or because this is what would be best?
No, what I'm saying is that if, let's say, the center, whoever is the center's candidate or candidates run in the next election and say, we want a two-state solution as our main point of platform, they will lose the election because the public is not ready to vote for that. They have to run on other issues like the government's failure on the pandemic and other issues, win power, and then try to shape public opinion back from a position of heading the government. And then, after a certain period, the public, I think, could be tilted back. Now, I'd like also to say something about the normalization agreements. Maybe one of the most important aspects of the normalization agreements is that it could help change the Israeli public's attitude to the Arabs and to the Arab world. Because when Israelis go to the Emirates or to Bahrain, I'm not talking about Sudan, it's a different story, but they will see something very different from what we see here in the Levant or in Egypt. They will meet a different attitude. They see very different countries. There may be a warmer peace than the cold peace that we have with Egypt and Jordan. And I think that gradually this could change the outlook of Israelis. So to me, one of the most important aspects of the normalization is the potential impact that it could have, the benign potential impact it could have on Israeli public's attitude to the Arab world and to Arabs.
Mm-hmm. But they can go to Abu Dhabi, but they can't go to Ramallah. So the question is now, I'm asking you, Mairav, how would you assess the internal pressure on the government and the protests that are going on right now? How could they translate into pressure on finding a solution with the Palestinians?
Yeah, well, I mean, Israel has no incentive to find a solution with the Palestinians. And I mean, since Rabin, that has been the game in town, that actually, if the argument was that it's in Israel's interest militarily and economically to give up land for peace, today there is no such incentive. And that's a big part of the international community's fault. But if we look internally to what's going on in Israel, I mean, I disagree with Itamar. I don't think there is a center. There is no center in Israel. And the center that he's talking about is incoherent. It cannot win elections. It failed completely to create a vision for an alternative. And what we're seeing play out right now is the people who voted for Gantz, some of whom would identify as left, realizing that actually they gave up their vote and they've been betrayed. And you know, what you basically have is a huge political vacuum where you have right and you have left and not much in the middle. And what is hopeful for me about the protests, and I've been following them as closely as I can from here, the anti-Netanyahu protests, they started out as I mean, there's been different elements within them. You know, one element has been anti-corruption since he's been indicted, but other elements have been precisely on the issues that Netanyahu is doing nothing to promote Israel's, you know, welfare in the long run. So what you're seeing in these anti-Netanyahu, these protests are not about the occupation, they're not about left and right, but you know, on Saturday night, I think there were signs up, people saying Netanyahu is still on the balcony in Jerusalem. In Kikar Paris. And these are people who were born only into a Netanyahu government, many of them, 20-year-olds. They don't know anything else. They don't know right and left. They know that they are currently facing a very dire future, both economically and militarily. So I think a lot of these people who are going out into the streets right now and they're facing police brutality. I mean, you had 2 weeks out of a 3-week lockdown, I believe, in which protests were essentially banned. Now, of course, there is still freedom for protest for Jews in Israel. It's not that it's been taken away, but you have a lot of, you know, middle and upper class Israelis who are suddenly being beaten up. They're being sprayed with water cannons. They're being surveilled by undercover cops. And these are things that they've never encountered. But if you walk a few miles to the other side of the Green Line, that's what happens all the time. It also happens to certain minority groups inside Israel. But the thought that Israel can continue to be an occupying power and to have huge, huge roles of surveillance and police brutality and all the things that it does on a daily basis, and to think that that's not going to affect even the good citizens of the country is a complete illusion. And so what you have are very small cracks in the consensus now, where Jewish Israelis are finally starting to get the tiniest taste of what other groups under Israeli control have gotten for a very long time, and that will hopefully start to change public opinion. But to sum this up, I mean, the notion that you can just kind of talk about some kind of status quo, hoping for a two-state solution one day, I mean, it's all bullshit. You have to come up with a vision. And for many Jews in Israel like myself, that vision has to be one of cooperation, has to be one of equal rights, has to be one of justice and democracy. It can't happen in the way that it's going on right now. It's going to go nowhere very fast.
Mm-hmm. But isn't that a contradiction? You're saying on the one hand, you're saying there's no center in Israel. On the other hand, you're saying the protests are about anti-corruption, welfare, which is definitely not leftist ideas and also not specifically rightist ideas. That would be, classical center ideas. So,
yeah.
What do you mean?
Yeah. Let me, Maria. Peace is not made from the left. Peace is made from the center. And also, peace did not die with Rabin. The main because after Rabin, Barak and Sharon and Olmert all wanted to move forward in a peace process. None of them came from the left. All were centrist. I mean, it's not enough to have a good idea. You need to make sure that you carry the public with you. Part of the component of leadership is the ability of the leader not just to have a vision and the courage to try to implement it, but also to be able to carry his or her own people with them. And so a leftist will not carry the Israeli public with a firebrand rhetoric. It would have to be, and that person does not exist on the scene right now, unfortunately. That's part of the issue. Gantz seemed for a while to have that potential, and of course it dried up. But if you look at someone like Sharon, who was the father of the settlements, and when he became prime minister, changed his mind and took us out of Gaza. Ehud Olmert grew up in a hardcore Likud home, and what he put on the table in his negotiations with Abu Mazen in 2008 was a very far-reaching platform, a plan for peacemaking. And unfortunately, Abu Mazen made a huge mistake by not responding to it. So I would look for in order to see a change, for a centrist figure with hopefully security credentials, somebody who can appeal to a large part of the Israeli public. Now, as for the demonstrations, there was an interesting phenomenon when demonstrations were banned in the center of Jerusalem near the Prime Minister's residence. 200 sites in Israel sprang up with local demonstrations. We have a couple near our home. You could see 1,500 people. And suddenly, the government realized, or Netanyahu realized, that he didn't have a small demonstrations in front of his home. He had 200,000 people demonstrating all over the country. So there is anger, there is a potential. At this point, not enough to bring about the change. I mean, the 200,000 people demonstrating will not bring down this government. There have to be a much more extensive and a much more profound movement. I don't see yet a change coming through the demonstrations that we are having right now.
I agree.
Finally. Maria, Israel is a very small country. When Mairav and I were corresponding before the program in order to introduce ourselves to one another, turned out that I was very friendly with her late grandfather, Shimshon Arad, who was one of Israel's greatest diplomats. He was a very effective ambassador and a foreign policy intellectual. So it is a small country.
Yeah. But you're saying, there was a name dropping of different personalities who could be the probably charismatic leaders of a center left. Among any of these names, would there be somebody who, who you would trust to be able to gather a lot of people for a change of the system, as you mentioned before?
You mentioned a few names. Give me one or two, because I don't see them. The one person who has the force of personality and the eloquence and the power to do that, Ehud Barak, but Ehud Barak is not electable in Israel. So he is the most powerful critic of Netanyahu and the government. His performance on television and radio is very powerful, and the written press, but it's not going to be translated into running for office and winning it. And I don't see another name on the scene right now.
Now we have a question here. I see in the Q&A. In the last election, the Palestinian-Israeli parties reached out a hand to the centrist Israeli parties by supporting a potential government. Is there a possibility for change? How important is the general take on the subject? Whoever wants to answer.
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond. I think that this is one of the most important developments in Israeli politics. First of all, the fact that the Arab parties put their action together and ran as one list and reached a significant number. Potentially that 20% of the population, they could have 24 members in the Knesset, and it's a young population. And since the country is divided between right and left, they could be the swing vote. So potentially, they could have a huge influence in Israeli politics. But in order second is that in Arab civil society, the Palestinian or Israeli Arab civil society, it very much wants to become part of Israeli life. And not talking about the politicians, not talking about all the intellectuals, but the average person, the one who studies engineering, medicine. So, 24% of the students in the Technion in Haifa are Arabs. Tel Aviv University, from 3% when I was president to 15% Arab students today. Number of doctors, nurses, pharmacists, so forth is growing. People are moving from their towns and villages to Haifa, Tel Aviv. This is a very, very welcome development. It has not been translated yet into a political reality where an Israeli Arab party don't have to be Zionist, but they have to figure out a platform that would enable them to participate fully in politics, including to be a partner in a coalition. At this point, we are talking at best about supporting a center-left coalition from the outside. So voting for them, but not being part of the coalition. That also is not that easy. But that would be a step forward. So
but even
it's
that
potentially
possible.
Even that, because of 2 or 3 members of Gantz's party, it failed. They objected. It was close, but it failed. But in the future, it's bound to happen. I mean, and we speak about the challenges of Israel as a state. Finding a formula that would enable the 20% Arabs or Palestinians who live here to be part of the state. To be part of the state is a huge challenge. And you know, unfortunately, you're Austrian. We have to remember what happened in Austria the other night. What is happening in France? Europe also has a problem of integrating large Muslim minorities into the mainstream of life in Europe. Here, it's even a more acute issue, and among the many challenges that we have to confront and solve in the coming years, this is one of the most important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But are you implying that it's difficult to integrate them because they are Muslims, or does it have other reasons?
No, you know, it's very difficult. It's very difficult it's easy for an Israeli Arab to go to university, finish, graduate from medical school, and become a doctor, and find an apartment in Tel Aviv, and and live life. But it's very difficult for an Israeli Arab politician to swear allegiance to the state. It's the state that defeated. One of them said many years ago, but it remains true. What can I do? My tragedy is that my people is in conflict with my state. And resolving that issue is a problem for them, for the Arab minority, and for us, the majority. Have to find a definition of Israel or being Israeli that is inclusive enough to enable the Palestinians to become part of it, and for them not just to accept the reality, the daily reality of this life, but also to be able for the leadership to formulate it in explicit political terms.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, if I may,
just before I give the turn to you, I would like to invite the audience. If you have any questions or remarks, there's this Q&A button here. You can just write them down, and I'm happy to read them out for you. So yeah, Mairav, please.
No, I just, it's building off of what Itamar said. It's not that I necessarily disagree with everything, but, I mean, this is, if you put for a second the Palestinians a two-state solution aside, Israel on its own has to deal with its Palestinian citizens, and it's never done so. And it's absolutely mind-boggling that there has never been a Palestinian political entity inside an Israeli Knesset. And the most that it's gotten is when Rabin did, use them from the outside for support, which was groundbreaking. And, Gantz couldn't do it. And that's not just because of a few people in his party, it's because that is a systemic problem in Israeli society, and a problem that has yet to be addressed within Jewish Israeli politics. How do you have a democratic state with a huge national minority that cannot be expected to swear allegiance in the same way? And when you look at what they've done to integrate, it's really, I mean, look at the laws that have been passed over the last decade, the Nakba law, the complete erasure of any, just a basic recognition of the fact that they belong to a different culture and a different society. And yet they still choose to integrate. They still choose to be politically active in a way that, most of the onus and the responsibility, at least in recent years, can be put on the Israeli government and on the Israeli body politic for not actually being able to reconcile how to be a democratic state that integrates citizens who are not Jewish. I mean, this is a major, major problem that Israel hasn't been able to deal with. Think about offering settlers in the West Bank to stay there and become citizens of a Palestinian state. I mean, look at the reverse option. I don't think anybody really expects that to happen. So, I mean, this has to do with how to be a democracy that's multicultural and multi-ethnic. And this is a problem of Zionism conceptually that has not been solved.
We have another question here from the audience. Isn't that the situation of Jews in the diaspora? Allegiance to Israel and to their country of birth?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
You mean it's probably what you call the dual loyalty question. I mean, sometimes in some countries people find it difficult, or governments find it difficult to say that people who are, let's say, hyphenated, like Jewish Americans or French Jews are citizens, loyal citizens of the country, and yet have a deep sentiment for another country, which is Israel. It's not an issue in most places because French Jews are first and foremost French, and American Jews are first and foremost American. Actually, if you look closely, most American Jews have not come to Israel, have not visited, and look at the latest election in America. Actually, an opposite picture. In this country, 70% of the Israelis supported Trump. 70% of American Jews supported Biden because they don't look at it through an Israeli lens, they look at it through an American lens. We are American Jews, and we think that for us and for America, say they, we want Biden, we don't want Trump. So I don't think it's a major issue.
Mm-hmm. And some people also have dual citizenship, and they can, like Mairav has.
Yeah, but in today's world, there are so many dual. Most countries in the world became tolerant of dual citizenship, and for many people, the second passport is passport of convenience. The allegiance normally is in one place.
Well, I think the issue is also that Israel has, from its establishment, claimed to speak on behalf of the Jewish people on a whole. And, part of the tenets of Zionism is to make your Jewish identity and your national identity become one. It hasn't succeeded in doing that, but the right of return solely for Jews makes it so that a Jewish person anywhere in the world can instantly become an Israeli citizen. And so that does change the balance and the dynamics. If you compare it to the Palestinian diaspora, for example, some of whom cannot even visit the places that they were born or that their parents were born. So that doesn't change necessarily. It's not a dual loyalty issue. It's an issue of the balance of power.
Mm-hmm. Now, what we talked about before, the divisions in Israeli society and between left and right, between religious and non-religious, between different groups of origin. We see, and also polls show us that incitement against some of these groups has been on the increase in the past few months or years. Now, incitement is also a topic that connects us to the assassination of Rabin. Itamar, I know you are convinced that some mistakes happened right after the assassination of dealing with this incitement. If I understood it right, you said that not enough has been done back then. Could you maybe clarify what you mean by that? And do you think that had it happened back then, we would be in a different situation right now?
Yeah, I think one of Shimon Peres's mistakes when he succeeded Rabin as prime minister after the assassination was a deliberate decision not to go after the inciters. And there was a commission of inquiry led by Chief Justice Meir Shamgar to look into the mostly security failures in the assassination. The mandate of the commission was not to look at the incitement that preceded the assassination. Some of the inciters, or most of the major inciters, some of them rabbis in settlements, who not only incited, who actually sanctioned the assassination. They gave an explicit sanction to assassinate Rabin. They were not prosecuted. And some of them are still active and still continue to spill their doctrines. So it was a mistake, and we are paying some of the price for it even today. Now, the incitement to date, 25 years later, is different because of the proliferation of the social media. It's not so much a matter of public acts in the streets. It's most of the hatred and incitement. You can find them on the social media. But it's a huge, not only in this country, in other countries as well. I think this is something all Western societies will have to deal with, including the United States. I think we see some of that, the fruits or the bad negative fruits of that in the States today. So incitement is or hatred or hate mongering is a big problem. And one of my complaints about the Prime Minister is that he does not speak explicitly and powerfully as he can do against incitement. And in fact, when he spoke at the memorial for Rabin in the Knesset, when he came to incitement, he spoke about incitement against himself, which was a bit peculiar. But one of the marks of leadership needs for the Prime Minister and other major figures in politics and public life to come out in a powerful way against hate mongering.
Mm-hmm.
If I can just add to that, I think a lot of people hold Netanyahu responsible for a lot of the normalization of the incitement that happened in the run-up to Rabin's assassination, and he's continued it till today. I mean, if you look at everybody who disagrees with Netanyahu is a leftist. I mean, Avigdor Lieberman, in his view, is a leftist now. And the incitement, it's something that has grown not just through Netanyahu, it's grown through institutions, it's grown through right-wing media. And I think one of the biggest failures in Israel to deal with the right wing is through the media. We can have a whole panel just on that. But the media narrative on the major channels in Israel, it gives Netanyahu a full, it just kind of, a shofar, it just goes right through his talking points. There's very little challenging of Netanyahu's talking points. And it really did start with Rabin. It started there, and it has continued. And I remember I wrote a piece for the New York Times in 2014 after the Gaza offensive, when actors and musicians and others were speaking out against what Israel was doing in Gaza, and they lost contracts, they lost audiences. People were chased in the streets for protesting the Gaza offensive. And Netanyahu has said nothing, not then and not today. He might say something like the violence is bad on both sides against the police and against the protesters, but you have a very clear radical far right who is inciting against these people and suppressing their right to vote through intimidation, and he has said nothing about it.
But what are Israel's options of resilience against this incitement? What options does society or does the state have to defend itself against incitement?
I mean, it's a very good question. I think it has a lot to do with building institutions, education, and media that are much better positioned. I mean, if you look at how Israelis are taught about Rabin's assassination today, if you look at the education ministers that have come forward in the last decade, that's already like the core of the problem right there. They're not even able to separate, or more correctly, they do separate. They talk about it as if it wasn't a political assassination, as if it was some kind of aberration from the norm, or some, something that is unexplainable, and not being able to deal with it head on is a big part of the problem. But I mean, I don't know the answer. It's a long ways away.
Itamar, do you have an idea? And I think you mentioned that it would have been brought to the justice system. Am I right?
It should have been brought to.
It should have been prosecuted. It should have been brought to.
No, I think inciters should be prosecuted. Huge role to the education system. What happens in schools. And I think leadership by the leadership. Number 4, I think we need to not just depend the independence of the media, but to make sure that there are television channels, radio stations with a different voice. So it's a very extensive effort that needs to be invested. And there's even also the legal. You know, the United States is dealing with the issue right now with the powerful, huge tech companies. I mean, taking on Facebook, Google, and so forth is a huge task even for the U.S. government. But part of what is happening with the social media can be dealt with through regulation. So it's a manifold effort. It's not that one magic measure would deal with the problem.
We have another question from the audience. It's a question for Mairav. The Israeli left is integrated in the last election. What were the mistakes? Where do you see chances to rebuild it?
Yeah, I mean, the Israeli left is, it's hard for me to describe what that is today. The Labor Party is completely in shambles. You know, I don't know if the space now between what's happening amongst the opposition and in the streets is able to recreate something. But you know, we've had this situation for quite a while, and I think the only way is to start creating new parties and new alliances. And I think that there are some discussions about that. People in Meretz have discussed more Arab-Jewish cooperation. But as far as Meretz and the Joint List, to me, are the only political parties that represent a left today in Israel. And then the other parties, Yair Lapid, and whatever's left of labor, they need to figure out what they want to do. I don't think that they know that right now, and I think that we are stuck in this loop of coalitions where the proliferation of all these little parties and the power that the ultra-Orthodox have is going to continue to be sustained. And it's very frustrating because if you look at the election outcome of the last time, I think the bloc with Gantz against Netanyahu had a majority. It had 62 seats if you put them all together. But again, this goes back to the issue of how to work with the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I think that that's something that the Israeli left is going to have to face. It's going to have to face an issue not of Jewish and non-Jewish, two-state solution or not two-state solution. It's going to have to deal with values, of equality and of justice and of what democracy should look like. And I think that's the only way for a real left to build itself over a long period of time. I hope that answers the question.
But do you think, that the Israeli left is at its full potential right now? I mean, do you think that the voter potential would be much bigger than it is represented in the Knesset right now?
You mean are people voting?
Like if there was a more attractive offer for voters, would they take the chance, or do they say, no, we're not interested in leftist ideas in any case?
I mean, I think it's probably the latter. As Itamar had said before, the public opinion is something that needs to be rebuilt. But I do think that it's a mixture of having to rebuild through institutions, through civil society, and also through finding a leader that can really lead. I mean, if you look at somebody like Yair Lapid, his messaging has gone back and forth, on issues that matter to the core left of Israel, like the occupation and human rights. He has been horrible and nowhere to be found. So he has kind of flip-flopped as has been strategically of interest to him. And I'm hoping again that the kind of unabashed way in which Netanyahu has consolidated power, and the fact that the only people who are polling, close to him are now to his right with Bennett, I'm hoping that will open up more opportunities. And I do think that the bubble has burst for younger Israelis who realize that if they don't start to become more active in politics, that this is going to continue to happen. So there is, I'm hopeful that there is a waking up.
Do you see that right now in the demonstrations, that also problem of the settlements and occupation play a role in the demonstrations? Before you said it's mostly, or it was in the beginning mostly about anti-corruption and welfare. But do you see that something arises from there, from this Raklo Bibi in a direction of, no, we also care about this issue?
There are groups within, the protests that are very much putting forward this messaging. They're connecting between what happens to Ethiopian Jews when they protest, what happens to Palestinians when they're shot for no reason in the middle of East Jerusalem. They're starting to make those connections. But I think at the end of the day, the reason most Israelis are protesting is because they have nowhere to go, they have no work, they're economically facing disaster, most of them artists, freelancers, students, and they are realizing that they need to start to take action in some way. I don't think occupation is the main thing on their minds for most of them. But I think that through this kind of activism, and ironically, it is, of course, when you're hit economically that you start to deal with the issues of your government and what their values are and what it's about. So, through economic hardship, maybe more and more Israelis will start to make those connections. I mean, when you had the 2011 social justice protests, it was the same thing where there wasn't much enough of the main issue facing Israel is its conflict with the Palestinians. That's always going to be the case, and the economy and everything else is interconnected. So it's the same thing. You're going to have to at some point face that and integrate all those issues together.
Now we're facing this big frustration about the socio-economic situation right now in Israel. And obviously who's benefiting from that in terms of votes is Naftali Bennett. It's the right and it's not the left. Itamar, what do you think? Is that is it just because he's such an attractive person as a politician to vote for, or is it the lack of attractive people on the left side, or is it more a global phenomenon that in general the right wing is?
No, first of all, much of his support is very soft. Happened to him in earlier elections too, that he did very well in the polls, and when it came to the actual voting, he barely made it. His success, I mean, he's a gifted politician. He had a mentor. Mentor is called Benjamin Netanyahu. He and his partner Ayelet Shaked worked together in Netanyahu's office, and they had an opportunity to watch close by how the maestro does what he does, and he's in some respects even perfected the doctrine. He does it very well. Now, he also had a very cunning understanding that in order to attract the public, slogans are not enough. You have to persuade the public that you represent substance. So during the latest operation in Gaza, he was very active. He's the one who claims to have found the tunnels. During the pandemic, he's dealing seriously or semi-seriously with the pandemic, and he even wrote a booklet about the pandemic, sort of an expert overnight in public health, but it makes impression on people. And that's one of his advantages over his former friend Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid, as Mairav said, he doesn't seem to represent substance. He seems to shift from A to B and from B to C. And Bennett has the capacity to present itself as a serious, not politician, but political leader with an agenda and an expertise. And that made an impression on the public, but much of it could evaporate by voting day. And remember also, he criticizes Netanyahu, but he absolutely refuses to say that he will not join Netanyahu after a forthcoming election, when there is one. So people, when it gets close to the election, people who do not want to see Netanyahu return to power will not vote for Bennett, because they will understand that a vote for Bennett is ultimately a vote for Netanyahu, or a perpetuation of Netanyahu.
Mm. Mm. Now, you mentioned the COVID crisis. I mean, this is what is remarkable is that this is probably the first major crisis in Israel that doesn't have anything to do with security. So could it be? I mean, probably this is utopia, but could it happen that facing that this is a crisis that affects us all, and that it requires joint forces to combat it? And we see it in hospitals, we see it in the education system, we see that people have the feeling that they have to be more like entrepreneurs dealing with that situation because they can't trust politics anymore. Could this be a starting point for political change to get out of this stagnation, this feeling of frustration that is here?
Well, this could be the obvious failure of the government to put together a coherent, sustained policy. Could be the undoing of this coalition, of this government. Public is very unhappy, and you can ask yourself, why has the policy not been successful? The answer is that the political system is broken. It's impossible for the government to put together the right policy and to implement it, because if you do one thing, then the ultra-Orthodox partners in the coalition threaten Netanyahu, and if you do something else, and another element in society represented, and there is underlying lack of trust in Netanyahu, the sense that he's not running a straightforward policy for the best of the country, but that he's acting in order to protect himself, to deal with his own legal cases. So it's impossible to put together and conduct an effective policy under these terms. Of course, what is happening now in Europe is going to make life easier for the government, because the line is going to see, well, we told you, we had a second lockdown, so do so many European countries now. So we are actually not doing that badly. I'm sure this is going to be the government line the next few weeks.
Mairav?
Yeah, I mean, it already is the government line, but you know, I think the coronavirus in Israel, as in most other countries, certainly in the US, and I'm Biden just won Wisconsin, so I'm really hoping that he's going to pull through. But you know, it's kind of like if coronavirus it just kind of takes away all the veils and it shows what a government is capable of. And in Israel, as a small country, it's always been a country that, compared to the US, for me, has been one where the healthcare is universal for the most part, and where you can really rely on these things to be able to pull through. And in this case, it's been stumbling for a variety of reasons, not all in the power of the government necessarily. This is a virus that we don't completely understand, but I think it's very clear. I mean, there was a poll recently by the Israel Democracy Institute that the majority of Israelis believe that the lockdown that happened, the second one, was primarily for political reasons and not health reasons. And there were plenty of health officials that talked about it not being effective in the way that it was implemented. And I think that there is consensus amongst many people in Israel that Netanyahu is acting solely for one purpose, which is to evade his court hearings, to evade any kind of justice. When you think about it, it's absolutely inconceivable that the man is indicted on 3 separate charges of bribery, breach of trust, and fraud, and he hasn't stepped down, and that's insane. And so the lack of trust of Israeli citizens in the process now, and in the the ultra-Orthodox is a whole other bag of worms. I don't hold them solely responsible. I think it's also the responsibility of the government and how they've handled it. But there's a complete lack of trust in both sectors of Israeli society, and I'm hoping that will create an opening for rethinking leadership and rethinking, how to trust the government to take care of what is a health issue. It is, a health and economic issue, which Netanyahu is just, he's proven that he's not actually interested in solving it.
I think we almost ran out of time, but there's one more question that I see here. No, actually two more questions, and I will ask both of them together, and then you just you're free to choose who wants to answer, or both of you want to answer. Does the trauma of Rabin's assassination still play a role in Israeli politics, or has it become a sort of sentimental memorialization? That's the first question. And just to let you know that it was a real pleasure watching you, such a very intelligent and interesting interchange of points of view. Kudos for you all. You just showed me that not all is lost in this country. Wow, that's beautiful. So who wants to answer to this question about the
I'll take the first one, and a very brief answer. The answer is no. The trauma of Rabin's assassination does not play a role in Israeli politics or public life today. It's commemorated, but it has no real impact on political life in the country, unfortunately.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it goes back to what I said in the beginning. I mean, I think, to me, Rabin was very much coming from a place of, finding the best way for Israel to become a sustainable, normalized country. And, I do think that that vacuum exists today. And I think what's truly tragic is that, what he did, which was so groundbreaking, was to recognize that Israelis are stuck with the Palestinians, and they're going to have to deal with it. And his recognition of the PLO was groundbreaking. And so the fact that we're actually backwards today from there, that we've gone even farther backwards, is truly tragic. And I think what is missing right now in Israel is that notion that, we don't want 18-year-olds to go and, be occupying soldiers forever. I mean, and that sentiment, no matter how you get there, that sentiment is almost missing today. It's almost as if, many Israelis have just, they've just decided we can't do anything. This is just what we're stuck with. And, because their GDP is doing well, then they have the luxury to be in that place. But now things are changing. And, I do hope that the Israelis who grew up only with Netanyahu will start to make those changes. I mean, that's the only hopeful note that I can, end on, is that eventually things will have to change. So.
Good. So we managed in 1.5 hours to come from a very sad position to a little bit of hope in the end. I would like to thank you both for this interesting and insightful discussion. And I would like to hand over to Marietta, who I think you have one more announcement now for us to do. Marietta, are you here?
Okay, I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
I want to thank all of you panelists, Itamar, Mairav, and Maria. Thank you very much for participating. And also I thank the audience for joining us. And dear Salon friends, this month we are going to continue with our next event. It's going to be on the 23rd of November at the same time, and also again in Zoom, because as you know, we have to wait until next year to see each other live again. And next time we are going to have Nathan Schneider. He is professor of sociology at the Tel Aviv University, and he will present the discussion about the new anti-Semitism, and will also talk about the new edition of his book with the same title. Given the comprehensive nature of this anthology, we will have a thematic focus. This will be the Israel-related anti-Semitism. We could win Dr. Meron Mendel, who has been director of the Anne Frank Educational Facilities in Frankfurt and Kassel since 2010, as our discussion partner. And Michael Elm, whom you got to know as the founding member of our literary and political salon and moderator, will guide us through that next evening. So have a good evening for today, and take care, and stay all of you healthy wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Maria.
having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.